The September morning in 2024 broke with the kind of copper gold light that makes Prescott, Arizona legendary among photographers. Thomas Brennan had already been awake for 2 hours, preparing for the senior yoga class he'd taught every Monday and Thursday for 17 years at the Valley View Community Center. At 73, he moved with the careful precision of a man who understood his body's limitations, setting out foam mats in neat rows while humming the melody to Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, the same song that had been playing on the radio the night Jennifer Hayes disappeared 42 years ago. 6 unmarked vehicles from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department pulled into the parking lot at 6:47 a.m., their engines cutting through the morning silence like a knife. Detective Maria Santos stepped out first, her hand resting instinctively on the folder she'd been carrying for 18 months. The folder that contained a single fingerprint analysis that would destroy everything this community thought it knew about itself. Thomas Brennan didn't run. He didn't ask questions. When Detective Santos read him his rights in connection with the 1982 murder of Jennifer Hayes, neighbors would later describe how he simply nodded as if some part of him had been counting down to this moment for 4 decades. The yoga students arriving for class stood frozen in the parking lot, watching police lead away the man who'd taught their grandchildren guitar, who'd organized fundraisers for the local food bank, who'd been nominated for Prescott's Citizen of the Year award just 5 years earlier. Most disturbing of all, several of them would later remember seeing Thomas at the annual candlelight vigils for Jennifer Hayes, standing in the back with his head bowed, a man they'd assumed was simply a concerned community member paying respects to a murdered girl. They'd never imagined he was the one who'd strangled her in the back seat of his car, then carefully cleaned his fingernails before attending band practice at Prescott Middle School the next morning. Jennifer Marie Hayes had been 19 years old on the night of August 17, 1982, when she walked out of Melody Records at 6:47 p.m. and vanished from the parking lot of the Copper Ridge Shopping Center. For 42 years, her disappearance had haunted this mountain town of 45,000 residents, transforming from urgent breaking news to cold case file to something darker, a wound that never quite healed, a question mark that hung over Prescott like the monsoon clouds that gather each summer over the Bradshaw Mountains. The case had consumed 3 sheriffs, destroyed 2 marriages in the Hayes family, and turned Jennifer's mother, Mary, into a woman who kept the same phone number for 4 decades, just in case her daughter called. What none of them could have imagined, what seemed impossible even after DNA technology revolutionized criminal investigations in the 1990s and 2000s, was that Jennifer's killer had been hiding not just in plain sight, but in the most trusted corners of their community. He'd taught music to 3 generations of Prescott children. He'd volunteered at the elementary school library where Jennifer's younger sister brought her own kids to check out books. He'd played acoustic guitar at the memorial service held for Jennifer on the 10th anniversary of her disappearance, performing a moving rendition of Amazing Grace that left the entire church in tears. Before we reveal how a forensic breakthrough 4 decades in the making finally connected Thomas Brennan to Jennifer's murder, and how one detective's refusal to give up on a case everyone else had abandoned would crack the most carefully constructed facade in Arizona criminal history, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel brings you the cold cases that mainstream media forgets, the stories of justice delayed but never denied, the forensic miracles that give voice to victims decades after their deaths. What you're about to discover about how Thomas Brennan evaded capture for 42 years while building a life of respect and trust will fundamentally change how you think about the people around you. Jennifer Hayes had been electric. That's the word everyone used when they described her to investigators in those desperate first weeks after she vanished. Not just pretty or talented or ambitious, though she was all those things, but electric in the way she moved through the world as if she operated on a different frequency than everyone else in Prescott. Born June 3, 1963 to Douglas and Carol Hayes in a ranch house on the eastern edge of town, Jennifer was the youngest of 3 daughters in a family where music wasn't just a hobby but a language, a way of understanding the world. Her father worked as a foreman at the Freeport-McMoran copper smelting plant, coming home each evening with red dust on his boots and calluses on his hands that made it painful to play the guitar he loved. Her mother managed the administrative office at Prescott Valley Elementary School, a job that paid modestly but came with health insurance and summers off, luxuries that mattered for a working-class family in early 1980s Arizona. From the time she could walk, Jennifer gravitated towards sound. At 4 years old, she could identify songs on the radio within 3 notes. At 7, she taught herself to play her father's battered acoustic guitar by watching him and mimicking the finger positions. By 13, she was playing clarinet in the Prescott High School marching band, composing her own melodies on a used keyboard her parents had scraped together money to buy her for Christmas, and spending her weekends at the public library studying the album covers and liner notes of every record they had, from Motown to Mozart. Her bedroom walls were covered not just with posters of Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles, but with hand-drawn staff paper where she'd transcribe guitar solos note by note, trying to understand the architecture of music that moved her. She wasn't content to just listen or perform. She wanted to comprehend how songs were built, why certain chord progressions made people cry, what separated a good melody from one that would lodge in your brain for decades. Jennifer graduated from Prescott High School in May 1982 with a 3.7 GPA and a yearbook caption that read, "Plans to study music business and change the world, one song at a time." Those words would become unbearably prophetic just 3 months later. Her plan was methodical in the way that marked everything she did. Spend a year working full-time at Melody Records while taking night classes at Yavapai Community College, save every penny she could, and transfer to the music business program at Arizona State University in Tempe by fall 1983. She'd calculated exactly how much she needed, $5,040 for the first year, accounting for tuition, books, a shared apartment, and a used car reliable enough to make the 90-mile drive from Prescott to Phoenix. By August 1982, she'd saved $2,683, more than halfway to her goal, kept in a college fund jar on her dresser alongside a photograph of herself standing in front of the ASU campus during a visit the previous spring. The Prescott Jennifer knew in the summer of 1982 was a town of approximately 20,000 residents, small enough that you recognize familiar faces at the Safeway, but large enough to support a modest downtown strip of businesses, restaurants, and the independent record store where Jennifer worked 6 days a week. Founded during the 1860s gold rush, the town sat at 5,400 feet elevation in the ponderosa pine forests of north-central Arizona, offering a climate that locals described as perfect, 4 distinct seasons without the punishing heat that made southern Arizona unlivable in summer. The Copper Ridge Shopping Center, where Jennifer would disappear, had opened in 1978 on the eastern edge of town, a collection of 20 businesses anchored by a Safeway supermarket and including Melody Records, a hardware store, and a pizza restaurant popular with teenagers. The parking lot could hold approximately 200 vehicles and was bordered on 3 sides by undeveloped land covered with juniper trees and scrub brush that would eventually be cleared for additional development in the 1990s. Melody Records occupied a corner unit with large windows that faced the parking lot, giving employees a clear view of customers coming and going. The store's owner, Raymond Clark, had hired Jennifer in June 1982 specifically because of what he called her encyclopedic knowledge of music and her ability to connect with customers of any age. She could sell a Grateful Dead album to a 60-year-old accountant and a Duran Duran single to a construction worker, Raymond would tell investigators in those first desperate days after Jennifer vanished. She had this gift for understanding what people needed to hear, even when they didn't know it themselves. She'd work the afternoon shift from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m., helping customers navigate the store's collection of vinyl albums, cassette tapes, and the new compact discs that were just beginning to appear in 1982, expensive and exotic and promising a future where music would sound clearer than ever before. August 17th, 1982 was a Tuesday, unremarkable except for the heat. The temperature climbed to 94 degrees by noon, and by late afternoon the monsoon clouds were gathering over the mountains to the south, threatening the brief, violent thunderstorms that characterized Arizona summers. Jennifer arrived for her shift wearing jeans and a Fleetwood Mac concert t-shirt she'd bought at a show in Phoenix the previous summer. Her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her employee name tag pinned slightly crooked on her chest. According to Raymond Clark and Marcus Webb, the store's other employee working that day, Jennifer seemed in her usual good spirits, joking with customers and carefully organizing the new shipment of albums that had arrived that morning, making sure each record was filed alphabetically and that the display racks were perfectly aligned. She had a thing about order, Marcus would later tell detectives. Everything had to be just right, or it bothered her. At 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the store's 7 p.m. closing time, the phone rang. Raymond answered, spoke briefly with someone, then called Jennifer over and handed her the receiver. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, and though Raymond couldn't hear the other side, he remembered Jennifer's responses clearly enough to recite them to investigators, word for word, weeks later. "Yes, this is Jennifer. Really? Are you sure? Okay. I can be there in 10 minutes. No, that's fine. I'll come now." She hung up, grabbed her purse from beneath the counter, and told Raymond and Marcus she needed to run a quick errand but would be back before closing to help lock up. "I'll be 15 minutes tops," she said, pushing through the glass door into the August heat. Those were the last words anyone at Melody Records would hear Jennifer Hayes speak. When Jennifer hadn't returned by 7:30 p.m., Raymond tried calling her home. Carol Hayes answered, surprised to hear her daughter wasn't at work, but not yet worried. Jennifer often ran errands after her shift, stopping at the library or the grocery store or a friend's house, but when 9 p.m. came and went with no word, concern shifted into something darker. Douglas Hayes drove to the Copper Ridge Shopping Center where he found Jennifer's car, a 1979 Plymouth Horizon, with a distinctive dent in the passenger door, sitting alone in the employee parking area behind the store. The car was locked, engine cold, with Jennifer's employee discount card visible on the dashboard and her favorite cassette tape, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, still in the player. Her purse, wallet, and keys were gone, suggesting she'd taken them with her when she left the vehicle. But the driver's side window had been rolled down approximately 3 inches, unusual for someone leaving a car unattended in a public parking lot, with thunderstorms threatening. Most disturbing was what Douglas found on the pavement beside the driver's door, one of the small silver hoop earrings Jennifer wore every day, the back still attached as if it had been torn from her ear rather than simply fallen off. Douglas Hayes called the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department at 9:47 p.m., his voice steady despite the fear taking root in his chest like something alive and growing. The initial response reflected law enforcement attitudes of 1982, when missing adult cases didn't receive the immediate attention that would become standard in later decades. Deputies were dispatched, reports were filed, but the urgency wouldn't come until morning, until it became clear that Jennifer Hayes hadn't simply decided to take an unannounced trip or spend the night with friends. By midnight, the Hayes household had transformed into a command center of escalating panic, Carol calling every number she could find in Jennifer's address book. Her older sisters, Michelle and Stephanie, driving through town, checking every location where Jennifer might have stopped. Each empty parking lot, each darkened building, each unanswered question deepened the family's conviction that something terrible had happened during those 15 minutes between Jennifer leaving Melody Records and the moment she should have returned. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Department of 1982 consisted of 14 sworn officers, covering 8,028 square miles of territory, from high desert near Phoenix to the pine-covered mountains surrounding Prescott. Deputy Frank Morrison, who took the lead on Jennifer's case in those first critical hours, was a 20-year veteran whose experience consisted primarily of handling cattle, rustling cases, and domestic disputes rather than complex criminal investigations involving missing persons. His decisions in those first 48 hours, made with the limited resources and forensic knowledge available in early 1980s rural Arizona, would haunt the investigation for decades. The mysterious phone call at 6:45 p.m. emerged as the first significant lead, but efforts to trace it hit an immediate roadblock. Melody Records' phone line didn't have itemized billing showing incoming calls, and the telephone company informed Morrison that without a specific warrant and several days of processing time, they couldn't provide records of calls made to that number. By the time the warrant was obtained and the records pulled, the trail had gone cold. The search for Jennifer expanded rapidly as word of her disappearance spread through Prescott's tightly connected community. Volunteers organized by her father began combing the undeveloped land around Copper Ridge Shopping Center, calling her name into the growing darkness, examining ditches and ravines where she might have fallen or been concealed. The Yavapai County Search and Rescue Team deployed with tracking dogs that picked up Jennifer's scent in the employee parking lot near her car, but lost the trail after approximately 40 feet, suggesting she'd entered another vehicle either voluntarily or by force. By August 19th, 48 hours after Jennifer was last seen, the FBI had been notified and special agents had arrived from the Phoenix field office. The parking lot was declared a crime scene, and the 6-block radius around the shopping center was systematically searched by teams of volunteers who continued through sweltering August days and monsoon-drenched nights, driven by the desperate hope that Jennifer would be found alive. On August 20th, 3 days after Jennifer's disappearance, a development sent shockwaves through the investigation. Jennifer's backpack, the one she'd been known to carry containing her notebook of song transcriptions and music theory books, was found partially hidden beneath a juniper tree approximately 2 miles from the Copper Ridge Shopping Center, in an area of undeveloped land that would eventually become a residential subdivision. The backpack's discovery location was significant. Accessible by a dirt service road that ran behind the shopping center, a road used primarily by delivery trucks and known to local teenagers as a shortcut. Inside the backpack, investigators found Jennifer's notebook, her employee schedule from Melody Records, and a paperback copy of a music industry handbook she'd been reading. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood evidence, nothing to indicate what had happened beyond the silent testimony that Jennifer had been in this location or that someone had brought her belongings here to dispose of them. The backpack was sent to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Phoenix, where forensic technicians in 1982 employed what was then considered cutting-edge analysis. Fingerprints were lifted using powder dusting techniques, revealing only Jennifer's prints and one partial print that couldn't be matched to anyone in the limited databases available at that time. A single hair was found adhered to the notebook's spiral binding, a hair that didn't match Jennifer's or any family member's hair, but which 1982 technology could only analyze through visual comparison under a microscope, useful for excluding suspects, but rarely definitive enough for identification. That hair, carefully preserved in a paper envelope and stored in the evidence locker, would sit untouched for 42 years, waiting for science to evolve enough to extract the secrets coded in its protein structure. As August gave way to September with no trace of Jennifer Hayes, the investigation began its slow descent into the frustrating limbo that characterized cold cases. Deputy Morrison had interviewed over 200 people, followed up on 147 reported sightings of Jennifer from as far away as California and Texas, and generated case files that filled 4 bankers' boxes with reports, witness statements, and theories that led nowhere. 3 persons of interest emerged from the initial investigation. Robert Sanderson, a 24-year-old music distributor who visited Melody Records weekly and who several employees said had shown obvious interest in Jennifer, provided an alibi, placing him in Phoenix delivering inventory the day she disappeared, confirmed by multiple witnesses and delivery receipts. Kevin Matthews, Jennifer's ex-boyfriend from high school who'd struggled with their breakup 6 months earlier and had been seen driving past the Hayes house on several occasions, initially provided a weak alibi, claiming to be home alone, but his story was later corroborated by phone records and neighbor testimony. And Thomas Brennan, the 31-year-old music teacher at Prescott Middle School, who'd been giving Jennifer private guitar lessons since January 1982. Thomas Brennan's name appeared in Jennifer's diary multiple times, always in connection with her Saturday morning guitar lessons at his home studio. Several entries described feeling uncomfortable during recent lessons, though Jennifer never specified exactly what had made her uneasy. Other entries suggested she was considering ending the lessons, not because of anything specific Brennan had done, but because she felt she'd learned as much as she could from him and wanted to save money for college. When investigators interviewed Brennan on August 21, 1982, he stated he'd last seen Jennifer during her regular Saturday morning lesson on August 14th, 3 days before she disappeared. His alibi for the evening of August 17th was simple. He'd been home alone grading papers and preparing lesson plans for the upcoming school year, which would begin in less than 2 weeks. His wife had been visiting her sister in Flagstaff, leaving him alone in the house. He seemed genuinely shocked by Jennifer's disappearance, expressed hope she'd be found safely, and offered to help with the search if needed. Investigators found nothing suspicious in his demeanor or his statements. They had no forensic evidence connecting him to the crime scene, and they had no reason to doubt that a respected middle school teacher with no criminal record could be involved in the disappearance of a young woman who'd been his student. What investigators in 1982 couldn't have known, what the forensic science of that era couldn't reveal, was that Thomas Brennan's fingerprint was on the corner of Jennifer's music theory handbook inside the backpack found 2 miles from the shopping center. The print was partial, just 12 ridge characteristics, not enough for the manual comparison methods used in 1982 to make a definitive match. The print was photographed, cataloged as unknown partial, insufficient for comparison, and filed away in the evidence locker where it would remain for 42 years, waiting for automated fingerprint identification systems and advanced ridge analysis software that didn't exist yet, waiting for a detective who refused to accept that some cases were unsolvable, waiting for technology to finally speak for Jennifer Hayes, whose voice had been silenced in the back seat of Thomas Brennan's Chevrolet Monte Carlo on the evening of August 17, 1982, while Fleetwood Mac played on the radio and monsoon rain began to fall on the ponderosa pines outside Prescott, washing away any trace of what had happened on that dirt service road behind the Copper Ridge Shopping Center. By the first anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance in August 1983, the case had been reclassified as a cold case, a term that seemed to minimize the Hayes family's ongoing agony. The investigation hadn't been closed. It would remain officially active for decades, but the daily momentum had stalled. Deputy Morrison continued following up on occasional tips and conducting annual reviews of the evidence. But with each passing year, the likelihood of solving the case seemed to diminish. What Morrison and every investigator after him couldn't have anticipated was that Thomas Brennan would spend the next 4 decades building a life of such careful respectability that even when DNA technology and fingerprint databases revolutionized criminal investigation, no one would think to compare his prints or his DNA to evidence from a 40-year-old cold case. He would teach music to 3 generations of Prescott children. He would volunteer at community events and food banks. He would attend Jennifer Hayes' memorial vigils, standing in the back with his head bowed, hiding in the most dangerous place of all, plain sight, surrounded by people who trusted him completely, who would have defended his character if anyone had suggested he was capable of murder. The perfect facade, constructed over 4 decades, was about to be shattered by a single fingerprint and a detective who understood that justice delayed is still justice, even when it comes 42 years too late. Detective Maria Santos had spent 18 months living inside the Jennifer Hayes cold case, but the breakthrough that would finally crack it open arrived not from brilliant deduction or relentless interrogation, but from a fingerprint that had been sitting in an evidence box for 42 years, waiting for technology to evolve enough to read its secrets. The moment came on March 15, 2023, in a darkened conference room at the Phoenix Convention Center, where Santos sat among 300 law enforcement professionals, watching an FBI presenter demonstrate ridge analysis software that seemed like science fiction made real. The presentation focused on a Colorado case where a 12-point partial fingerprint, previously cataloged as insufficient for identification, had been successfully matched using artificial intelligence that could predict ridge patterns in damaged areas and compare them against databases with accuracy that made traditional comparison methods look like reading tea leaves. Santos took notes with the focused intensity of someone who understood she was witnessing the tool that would give Jennifer Hayes justice, her pen moving across the page so quickly that the detective sitting beside her later joked she must have been writing a novel. During the coffee break, Santos approached the presenter with such urgency that she nearly knocked over his cup, explained the Prescott cold case in breathless sentences that tumbled over each other, and walked away with contact information for the FBI laboratory in Quantico that had developed the software. Within 72 hours, she had secured authorization from Sheriff Marcus Wade, filled out 17 pages of paperwork, and personally driven the evidence box containing the partial print from Jennifer's music theory handbook to the Phoenix FBI field office, where it was photographed, documented, and shipped to Virginia with instructions that Santos's cell phone number should be called the moment results were available, regardless of time of day or night. The analysis consumed 6 weeks, during which Santos slept poorly, checked her email compulsively at 3 a.m., and drove her partner, Detective James Chen, to distraction with constant speculation about what the results might show. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on May 3rd, 2023, while Santos was sitting in her unmarked vehicle outside the Prescott Middle School, watching students file out for dismissal and thinking about how Jennifer Hayes would have been 60 years old now if Thomas Brennan hadn't stolen her future. The FBI analyst's voice was professional, but Santos could hear the suppressed excitement underneath. "Detective Santos, we have a confirmed match on your partial from the Hayes case. The print belongs to Thomas Eugene Brennan, age 73, current resident of Prescott, Arizona." Santos sat in her vehicle for 5 full minutes after the call ended, staring at the name written in her notebook, feeling something between triumph and nausea. She had spent 18 months developing theories about who had killed Jennifer Hayes, had investigated distant suspects and dead-end leads, and the answer had been hiding in plain sight all along, living 4 miles from where she sat, teaching guitar lessons in a home studio on Granite Street to children whose parents trusted him completely. The cross-referencing happened automatically, her mind accessing the digitized 1982 case files, where Brennan's name appeared exactly 3 times among 2,000 pages of investigative reports. Guitar teacher, interviewed August 21st, 1982. Alibi, Home Alone grading papers, no suspicious indicators. Case notes, cooperative, seemed genuinely concerned about Jennifer's welfare, offered to help with search efforts. What Santos discovered during the next 72 hours of intensive investigation would reveal not just a murder, but a 42-year performance of such calculated deception that it redefined her understanding of human capacity for evil. Thomas Brennan hadn't simply avoided suspicion in 1982, he had systematically embedded himself into the community's response to Jennifer's disappearance in ways that demonstrated either extraordinary psychological manipulation or the kind of arrogance that comes from believing forensic science would never catch up. Employment records showed that within 18 months of Jennifer's murder, Brennan had expanded his private music instruction business, advertising in the Prescott Daily Courier, and posting flyers at the elementary schools Jennifer's younger sister Michelle would eventually send her own children to attend. Over 4 decades, he had taught guitar and piano to an estimated 347 Prescott children, a number Santos calculated by reviewing the business license records and tax filings Brennan had meticulously maintained. He had volunteered at the elementary school library's reading program starting in 1995, the same year Michelle Hayes brought her 6-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, named for Jennifer, to check out books. Michelle would later tell investigators that Brennan had been kind to her daughter, had recommended books about music and musicians, had never given any indication that he was the man who had murdered her sister, and then watched her family suffer for decades while maintaining his facade of community-minded respectability. He had served on the Prescott Arts Council Board from 2001 to 2017, had organized fundraisers for music education programs in underfunded schools, had been featured in a 2015 Daily Courier article titled "Local Teachers 4 Decades of Service to Community Youth," that included a photograph of him surrounded by smiling students, all of them unaware they were posing with a murderer. But what Santos found in the historical archives of the Prescott Daily Courier made her hands shake with rage she had to consciously suppress to continue working. Photographs from memorial vigils spanning 3 decades showed Brennan attending at least 7 different commemorative events for Jennifer Hayes. There he stood in the back row of a 1987 candlelight vigil, head bowed, holding a candle like everyone else. There he appeared at the 10th anniversary memorial service in 1992, where the event program listed him as a special musical guest performing Amazing Grace on acoustic guitar. Santos tracked down attendees from that service, now in their 60s and 70s, who remembered Brennan's performance with painful clarity. His rendition was absolutely heartbreaking, said Patricia Morrison, who had been Jennifer's algebra teacher. He played with such emotion, such obvious grief. I remember thinking how beautiful it was that the community's musicians were honoring Jennifer through their art. If I had known... She couldn't finish the sentence. The most chilling photograph showed Brennan at the 30th anniversary vigil in 2012, standing less than 10 feet from Carol and Douglas Hayes, Jennifer's parents, who looked aged beyond their years by 3 decades of unanswered questions. In the photograph, Brennan is visible just over Douglas Hayes' left shoulder, his face composed in an expression that attendees had interpreted as solemn respect, but which Santos now recognized as something far darker. She showed the photograph to FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Michael Torres, who studied it for several minutes before delivering his assessment. That's not grief or respect you're seeing, Detective. That's satisfaction. He's watching the devastation he caused, observing the impact of his crime, and experiencing a sense of power from his secret knowledge. Attending victims' memorial services is extremely rare behavior, even among serial offenders. It suggests an extraordinary level of psychological compartmentalization and narcissistic grandiosity. The forensic reanalysis of the fingerprint evidence revealed details that explain precisely how and when Brennan had left his mark on Jennifer's property. The music theory handbook found in Jennifer's backpack 2 miles from the Copper Ridge Shopping Center was titled Contemporary Music Theory for Guitar Students by Robert Fielding, a textbook Brennan himself had recommended during their lessons, a detail documented in Jennifer's diary entry from July 12, 1982. Mr. B suggested I get the Fielding theory book to understand chord progressions better. Says it will help me write my own song someday. Expensive, $18.95, but we'll see if library has copy. The partial print had been lifted from the bottom right corner of the book's cover, in a position consistent with someone holding the book while examining it, perhaps deciding whether to purchase it for a student. What 1982 technology couldn't determine, but 2023 analysis revealed was the presence of microscopic automotive grease particles embedded within the fingerprint ridges themselves, particles that chemical spectrometry identified as consistent with lubricants used specifically in 1970s and early 1980s General Motors vehicles, particularly Chevrolet models. This discovery sent Santos to the DMV archives, where she discovered that Thomas Brennan had registered a 1979 Chevrolet Monte Carlo in Burgundy, the same general color category that 3 witnesses in 1982 had reported seeing in the Copper Ridge Shopping Center parking lot during the time frame of Jennifer's disappearance, descriptions that had been filed in the case notes but never connected to any specific suspect. The timeline Santos constructed of Brennan's activities in the weeks surrounding Jennifer's disappearance revealed a pattern the 1982 investigation had completely missed. Jennifer's diary contained 11 entries mentioning guitar lessons with Mr. B during the 8 months before her death, with increasing detail about her progress and her plans. The entry from July 28, 1982 read, "Getting pretty good at finger picking. Mr. B says I have natural talent. Made me feel good, but all so weird. He seemed too happy about it. Maybe just my imagination." August 6th. Lesson today. Mr. B asked about my college plans again. Told him ASU music business program. He got quiet, said I was too talented to leave Prescott, that I could build a career here teaching with him. Felt uncomfortable. Don't know why. The final diary entry mentioning Brennan, dated August 14th, 1982, 3 days before Jennifer disappeared, contained words that would haunt Santos for months. Last lesson with Mr. B today. Feel like I've learned everything I can from him. We'll tell him next week I'm stopping lessons to save money for college. Need every penny now that I'm so close to my goal. Hope he understands, but something tells me he won't. He gets this look sometimes when I talk about leaving Prescott, like he's angry but trying not to show it. Maybe I'm overthinking. Anyway, we'll call him Monday to let him know. That conversation, Santos realized, had never occurred. Jennifer had planned to inform Brennan on Monday, August 16th, that she was ending their teacher-student relationship. But the mysterious phone call at 6:45 p.m. on Tuesday, August 17th, the call that had prompted Jennifer to leave Melody Records 15 minutes before closing, had come from Brennan himself. Santos obtained phone records from 1982 that had been preserved in the case files, but never fully analyzed due to the technological limitations of that era. The records showed a call placed from a payphone on Montezuma Street, 3 blocks from Brennan's residence, to Melody Records at 6:43 p.m. on August 17, 1982, lasting 1 minute and 47 seconds. Raymond Clark, the store owner, had told investigators in 1982 that the caller had asked to speak with Jennifer specifically, had identified themselves as a friend from school, and had said something that prompted Jennifer to leave immediately. Santos located Clark, now 78 and living in Flagstaff, and conducted a follow-up interview where she asked him to recall the caller's voice with as much detail as possible after 4 decades. It was a man's voice, Clark said, his eyes distant with the effort of memory. Older than Jennifer's typical friends. At the time, I assumed it was maybe a college-age friend, someone she knew from her classes. He sounded urgent, but not panicked. He told Jennifer something about her car, said there was a problem with it, that he'd noticed something wrong and wanted her to check it before she drove home. I remember, because after she left, I thought it was strange that someone would call the store instead of just leaving a note on her car if they'd noticed a problem. But then she disappeared, and I told all this to the police, and I've wondered every day for 42 years if I should have done something different, said something to stop her from leaving. The investigation into Brennan's background before Prescott revealed the pattern Santos needed to establish his capacity for the violence Jennifer had suffered. Brennan had moved to Prescott in March 1978 from Flagstaff, where he had taught music at Sinagua Middle School for 3 years before his contract wasn't renewed, under circumstances that school district records described with bureaucratic vagueness as administrative concerns regarding professional boundaries. When Santos contacted the Flagstaff Unified School District's Human Resources Department, she learned that personnel files from 1975-1978 had been destroyed per the district's retention policy. But a retired administrator named Dorothy Keller, now 81, remembered the Brennan situation with uncomfortable clarity. "We couldn't prove anything prosecutable," Keller told Santos during a phone interview that Santos recorded with permission. But there were complaints from at least 4 different parents about Thomas being too friendly with their daughters, waiting after class to talk to them alone, offering to give them private lessons at reduced rates, showing up at school concerts and sitting near specific girls' families. One parent said he'd seen Thomas's car parked on his street 3 houses down from where his daughter lived on 2 different occasions, when Thomas had no legitimate reason to be in that neighborhood. "We asked Thomas to resign rather than face a formal investigation that could have damaged his teaching credentials permanently. He accepted immediately, said he understood there'd been misunderstandings, and moved to Prescott within a few weeks. I felt sick about that decision every day since I read about Jennifer Hayes' case. We just pushed the problem somewhere else." The pattern suggested Brennan had been fixating on young women throughout his teaching career, mostly containing his urges through observation and inappropriate but not criminal behavior, until the night of August 17, 1982, when Jennifer Hayes' plan to end their lessons, combined with her resemblance to the Flagstaff students he'd obsessed over, had triggered an escalation he could no longer control. Santos's working theory, developed with input from FBI behavioral analysts, reconstructed the crime based on evidence and psychological profiling. Brennan had learned about Jennifer's intention to stop lessons either by chance or through some surveillance of her activities. The call to Melody Records had been a pretext to get Jennifer alone, claiming her car had a problem that needed immediate attention. Jennifer, trusting her guitar teacher and concerned about her car's mechanical reliability, had left the store and found Brennan waiting in the employee parking lot. He'd convinced her to let him drive her somewhere to look at the car, or perhaps directly to his vehicle, claiming he'd seen the problem from the street. Once Jennifer was in his Chevrolet Monte Carlo, Brennan had driven not to examine her car, but to the dirt service road behind the shopping center, an area Santos confirmed from 1982. Aerial photographs would have been sufficiently isolated after 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. There, in the back seat of his car, while monsoon rain began to fall, Thomas Brennan had strangled Jennifer Hayes with his bare hands, a conclusion supported by the fact that no ligature or weapon had ever been recovered, and the autopsy Dr. Torres conducted, when Jennifer's remains were finally found, would confirm death by manual strangulation. The 16 months between Santos's identification of Brennan as the suspect and his eventual arrest were consumed by building a prosecutable case that could overcome the absence of eyewitnesses and the 4-decade gap between crime and trial. Santos discovered that Brennan had rented a storage unit at Prescott Self-Storage on Miller Valley Road continuously since January 1983, 5 months after Jennifer's murder, paying the monthly rental fee without fail for 41 years. The storage facility manager, reviewing records at Santos's request, found it unusual that anyone would maintain a unit for so long, especially a small 5x5 unit that cost relatively little, but added up to over $20,000 in cumulative rent across 4 decades. The search warrant execution on September the 15th, 2024, at storage unit number 247 produced evidence that transformed the case from strong to overwhelming. Inside a locked metal box, itself inside a larger locked toolbox, investigators found what Santos immediately recognized as Jennifer Hayes' class ring from Prescott High School, identifiable by the inscription inside the band, JMH, class of '82. Also in the box were 11 photographs of Jennifer, some cut from the Prescott High School yearbook, others appearing to have been taken without her knowledge, showing her at her car, entering Melody Records, and walking on the street. Most chilling was a small spiral-bound notebook containing what appeared to be observational notes written in Brennan's handwriting, documenting Jennifer's movements, work schedule, and habits over several weeks before her death. The final item in the box was a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper showing topographical features Santos recognized as the Bradshaw Mountains south of Prescott. The map marked a specific location with an X and the notation 8/18/82, 3:20 a.m. That date, August 18th, was the day after Jennifer disappeared. The time notation suggested Brennan had disposed of Jennifer's body in the early morning hours, approximately 8 hours after her murder. Santos organized a recovery operation involving the Yavapai County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team, FBI evidence recovery specialists, and forensic anthropologists from Arizona State University. The location marked on Brennan's map led them to a remote ravine approximately 43 miles south of Prescott, accessible only by a rough dirt road that would have required 4-wheel drive to navigate, which Brennan's 1979 Chevrolet Monte Carlo did not have. This discrepancy was resolved when Santos discovered that Brennan's brother-in-law, Michael Warner, had owned a 1978 Ford Bronco in 1982 and had been out of town on a business trip to San Diego from August 16th through August 20th, leaving his vehicle in Brennan's care to use for an unrelated errand. Warner, now 76 and living in Phoenix, was interviewed and confirmed he'd loaned Thomas the Bronco during that time frame, assuming it had been used only to pick up sheet music from a supplier in Flagstaff, as Brennan had claimed. The recovery of Jennifer's remains from the ravine on November 8, 2024, finally gave her family the closure of knowing where she had been for 42 years, though it opened new wounds in understanding how carefully Brennan had planned every aspect of her murder and concealment. The arrest of Thomas Brennan occurred at 6:47 a.m. on September 23, 2024, in the parking lot of the Valley View Community Center, where he had just finished setting up yoga mats for the senior class he'd been teaching every Monday and Thursday for 17 years. The tactical team positioned around the building included officers who had known Brennan personally, who had attended community events where he performed, whose children he had taught guitar. Detective Santos herself approached Brennan with the arrest warrant, her body camera recording every moment of an encounter that would later be played in court to demonstrate Brennan's extraordinary lack of emotional response. Thomas Eugene Brennan, Santos said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. You're under arrest for the murder of Jennifer Marie Hayes. Brennan's reaction would be analyzed by behavioral experts for months afterward. He didn't ask who or claim innocence or show any surprise whatsoever. He simply set down the yoga mat he'd been unrolling, looked at Santos with what she later described as a kind of resigned acknowledgement, and extended his hands for the handcuffs, as if he'd been expecting this moment for 42 years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. The yoga students arriving for class stood frozen in the parking lot, watching police lead away the man who'd taught them breathing techniques and meditation practices, who'd spoken often about mindfulness and living with intention, who'd seemed to embody the peaceful wisdom of someone who'd spent 7 decades learning how to exist harmoniously in the world. Martha Reynolds, 74, who'd attended Brennan's class for 12 years, would later tell reporters that watching his arrest was like discovering the earth was flat after all. Everything you thought you understood about reality just collapses, she said. Tom wasn't just our yoga teacher. He was someone many of us considered a friend. He'd been to my home for dinner. He'd met my grandchildren, and all that time he was... She couldn't finish the sentence. The interrogation that followed Brennan's arrest produced no confession, but it revealed aspects of his psychology that made Santos understand why he'd evaded capture for so long. Brennan sat across from Santos and FBI Special Agent Michael Chen in the same interrogation room where dozens of suspects had eventually broken under questioning. But Brennan's 4 decades of practice at compartmentalizing his guilt had prepared him for this moment in ways that made traditional interrogation techniques ineffective. He invoked his right to legal counsel immediately, but before his attorney arrived, he made one statement that Santos recorded and would later use to demonstrate his consciousness of guilt. I knew genetic genealogy would eventually catch up to me. I've been reading about it for years. The Golden State Killer, the other cold cases being solved. I understood it was only a matter of time before someone looked at Jennifer's case with fresh eyes and modern technology. I'm actually surprised it took this long. That statement, delivered with the same calm tone Brennan had used to teach guitar chords to children, contained no admission of guilt, but demonstrated his awareness that evidence existed to connect him to Jennifer's murder. His attorney, a high-priced criminal defense specialist named Robert Morrison from Phoenix, arrived within 2 hours and immediately shut down all communication. The strategy Morrison employed over the following months was predictable but effective. Attack the forensic evidence's reliability, emphasize the 42-year gap between crime and prosecution, and argue that the community's desire for closure had led to confirmation bias in the investigation. Morrison would call no witnesses at trial, including Brennan himself, preventing any cross-examination that might reveal the carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for 4 decades. But before the trial could begin, the community of Prescott had to process the revelation that one of their most trusted members had been harboring a terrible secret for longer than many residents had been alive. The Prescott Daily Courier ran a front-page story on September 24, 2024, the day after Brennan's arrest, with a headline that captured the collective disbelief. Beloved music teacher arrested in 1982, Hayes murder. The article included reactions from former students, parents, and colleagues, all expressing variations of the same shocked incomprehension. Sarah Mitchell, 38, who'd taken guitar lessons from Brennan for 4 years as a teenager, told reporters, "He taught me to play my favorite songs. He came to my high school graduation. He was at my wedding. And now I'm learning that the whole time he was someone who'd murdered a girl who was probably a lot like me." How do you process that? How do you reconcile those 2 versions of the same person? The Prescott Unified School District faced difficult questions about why Brennan had been allowed to volunteer in elementary schools despite the vague circumstances of his departure from Flagstaff schools in 1978. Superintendent Helen Cortez acknowledged at a September 26th press conference that the district's background check procedures in the 1980s and 1990s had been less rigorous than current standards. and that Brennan's voluntary position hadn't required the same scrutiny as hiring a full-time teacher would have. "We failed to protect our students," Cortez admitted, her voice breaking, "even though we have no evidence that Mr. Brennan acted inappropriately toward any child in our district. The fact that someone with his history and his secret was given access to our schools represents a systemic failure we must address." The trial of Thomas Eugene Brennan began on February 12, 2025, in Yavapai County Superior Court before Judge William Harrison, with a jury pool that had been extensively questioned about their familiarity with the case and their ability to remain impartial despite 4 decades of community investment in finding Jennifer Hayes' killer. The prosecution's case, methodically constructed by District Attorney Rebecca Morrison and presented with devastating precision by Assistant DA Kevin Martinez, walked the jury through every piece of evidence connecting Brennan to Jennifer's murder. The fingerprint analysis was explained by Dr. Sarah Chen from the FBI laboratory, who used visual presentations to show the jury exactly how the ridge analysis software had identified 12 matching characteristics between the partial print and Brennan's known prints, and how the probability of that match occurring by chance was approximately 1 in 7.2 trillion. The automotive grease particles embedded in the fingerprint were analyzed by forensic chemist Dr. Robert Fielding, who explained that the chemical composition was consistent with lubricants used in 1970s-era GM vehicles, and that the presence of these particles in the fingerprint's ridges indicated the print was made by someone who had recently been working on or around such a vehicle. The testimony about Brennan's Chevrolet Monte Carlo, his brother-in-law's Ford Bronco, and the timeline of Jennifer's disappearance created a narrative that even the defense's aggressive cross-examination couldn't effectively challenge. But the most powerful testimony came not from forensic experts, but from the people whose lives had been shaped by 42 years of unanswered questions. Michelle Hayes, now 58, took the witness stand on the trial's 4th day and described what it meant to grow up in the shadow of her sister's disappearance, to watch her parents transform from vibrant, middle-aged people into haunted shells, to name her own daughter Elizabeth in honor of an aunt she would never meet, and to later discover that the man who'd been kind to that daughter at the elementary school library was the same man who'd murdered her namesake. "I brought my child into the presence of my sister's killer," Michelle said, her voice breaking. "I smiled at him. I thanked him for recommending books for Elizabeth, and he smiled back, knowing what he'd done, knowing what he'd stolen from our family, and he said, 'It's my pleasure. Jennifer would have wanted me to help however I could.'" The defense's case rested on creating reasonable doubt about the forensic evidence and emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the prosecution's timeline. Attorney Morrison argued that a partial fingerprint on a textbook proved only that Brennan had handled the book at some point, possibly during a guitar lesson weeks before Jennifer's disappearance. He questioned the reliability of 42-year-old witness memories, pointed out that Jennifer's body had been too decomposed to determine exact cause of death through autopsy, and argued that the map found in Brennan's storage unit could have been created years after Jennifer's murder for any number of reasons. Morrison's closing argument acknowledged that his client's behavior in maintaining a storage unit full of Jennifer's belongings and attending memorial vigils appeared suspicious, but argued that suspicious behavior didn't equal proof beyond reasonable doubt of murder. The prosecution's rebuttal, delivered by District Attorney Morrison in a 90-minute closing argument that had several jurors visibly emotional, systematically dismantled every defense theory. She reminded the jury that Brennan had never reported finding Jennifer's class ring or photographs if they'd come into his possession innocently. She pointed out that the map's date notation of 8/18/82 at 3:20 a.m. demonstrated knowledge of Jennifer's remains location before anyone outside the killer could have known. She walked the jury through the pattern of Brennan's behavior over 42 years, attending vigils and performing at memorial services not out of genuine grief, but out of the narcissistic need to observe the impact of his crime and feel the secret power of his hidden knowledge. Thomas Brennan didn't just kill Jennifer Hayes on August 17, 1982, Morrison told the jury. He killed her again every day for 42 years when he walked through this community, teaching children, attending community events, and performing a version of grief and concern that was nothing but a mask covering his guilt. He taught guitar to hundreds of Prescott children, including Jennifer's niece, and maintained his facade so successfully that even experienced investigators in 1982 saw nothing suspicious when they interviewed him. That level of deception, that capacity to compartmentalize, that willingness to attend memorial services for a woman he murdered demonstrates not reasonable doubt about his guilt, but the extraordinary psychological manipulation that allowed him to hide in plain sight for 4 decades. The guilty verdict came on March 17, 2025, after 11 hours of deliberation spread across 2 days. Thomas Brennan, now 74 years old, showed no visible emotion as the jury foreman read the decision that would end his freedom after 42 years of living a lie. The sentencing hearing 3 weeks later brought closure to a case that had defined Prescott's collective trauma since 1982. Judge Harrison, before pronouncing sentence, addressed Brennan directly in remarks that court observers would later cite as remarkably powerful. Mr. Brennan, you stood before this community for 42 years as a teacher, a volunteer, and a trusted member of society. You taught children music. You performed at memorial services. You attended vigils for the young woman you murdered. That level of deception represents a betrayal not just of Jennifer Hayes and her family, but of every person who trusted you, every child you taught, every parent who welcomed you into their homes. The law allows me to sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, and I do so with the understanding that given your age, this effectively means you will die in prison. That's appropriate. Jennifer Hayes died at 19 with her whole future ahead of her. You took that future, and then you stole 42 more years from her family by concealing your crime and performing grief you never felt. Douglas Hayes had passed away in 2019, his final years consumed by the same unanswered questions that had haunted him since 1982. Carol Hayes, now 87 and using a wheelchair due to declining health, attended the sentencing surrounded by 3 generations of family members who had been born into a world where Jennifer's absence was simply a fact of life. When Judge Harrison offered her the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement, Carol spoke in a voice that carried the accumulated weight of 42 years of waiting. You took my daughter twice, Thomas, she said, looking directly at Brennan, who sat motionless at the defense table. Once when you killed her in August 1982, and again every single day for 42 years when you walked freely through our community teaching children, attending vigils, pretending to care. I've spent more of my life without Jennifer than I had with her. She was 19 when you murdered her. I'm now 87. That's 68 years of my life, and only 19 of them included my daughter. That arithmetic represents your cruelty in numbers I can understand. She paused, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. But I want you to know something, Thomas. You failed. You thought you'd gotten away with it. You thought you were so clever, so careful that you'd never face consequences. But science caught up to you. Detective Santos caught up to you. Justice caught up to you, and now everyone knows what you are, not a beloved teacher, not a community volunteer, not someone who cared about Jennifer's memory, a murderer who hid behind a mask for 42 years. You're 74 years old now, Thomas. You'll die in prison. And when you do, no one will mourn you. No one will remember you as anything but the man who killed Jennifer Hayes, and then had the audacity to teach children and perform at her memorial service. That's your legacy. That's all you'll ever be remembered for, and that seems like justice to me. The revelation of where Jennifer's body had been hidden came from the map found in Brennan's storage unit, which led recovery teams to a remote ravine in the Bradshaw Mountains, where Jennifer's remains were discovered in November 2024. The forensic anthropology team from Arizona State University, led by Dr. Patricia Morrison, worked for 5 days to carefully excavate the site, which had remained undisturbed for 42 years. Due to its extreme isolation, the remains were identified through dental records and DNA comparison, with samples provided by Carol Hayes. While decomposition had prevented determination of exact cause of death, the position of the skeletal remains and the presence of her jewelry confirmed this was Jennifer. The recovery finally allowed her family to lay her to rest after 42 years of not knowing where she had been, though it opened new wounds in understanding the geographic isolation Brennan had chosen to conceal his crime. The funeral service for Jennifer Marie Hayes took place on December 3, 2024, 42 years, 3 months, and 17 days after she disappeared from the Copper Ridge Shopping Center parking lot. The church overflowed with mourners representing 3 generations of Prescott residents, from those who had attended high school with Jennifer to children who knew her only as local history. The eulogy, delivered by her sister Michelle, spoke not of tragedy but of the bright, electric young woman who had dreamed of changing the world through music, whose potential had been stolen by someone she'd trusted enough to call a teacher, and whose memory would endure through the justice that had finally, impossibly, arrived. Jennifer would be 62 years old now, Michelle said from the pulpit. She might have been a grandmother. She might have built the music business career she dreamed about. She might have written songs that millions of people sang. We'll never know what she might have become. And that represents Thomas Brennan's crime, not just against Jennifer, but against everyone who would have known her, loved her, and been touched by her presence across 62 years. But I want to believe that somewhere, somehow, Jennifer knows that her killer was caught, that justice arrived even after 4 decades, and that she can finally rest. Thomas Brennan died in the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence on August 8, 2025, 6 months after beginning his life sentence. The cause of death was officially listed as cardiac arrest, though prisoners who'd been housed near him reported he'd been in declining health since his arrival and had refused most meals and medical treatment. He never provided additional details about what happened to Jennifer Hayes on August 17, 1982, never explained his decision-making process in strangling her, and never expressed remorse for either her murder or the 42 years of deception that had allowed him to live freely while her family suffered. His death closed the final chapter of a case that had consumed 3 generations of investigators and demonstrated how modern forensic technology could finally give voice to victims whose killers had believed they would never face consequences. For Carol Hayes, who passed away peacefully in her sleep on January 14, 2026, surrounded by family members who held her hands and told her she could finally let go, the knowledge that her daughter's killer had been brought to justice provided the closure she had sought for over 4 decades. Her final words, spoken to Michelle the evening before she died, were, "I can see Jennifer now. I can tell her that everyone knows the truth. I can tell her she's remembered not as a victim or a cold case, but as the bright, talented young woman she was. And I can tell her that Thomas Brennan will be forgotten, but she never will be." The Prescott Daily Courier's obituary for Carol Hayes ran on January 16, 2026, describing her not just as Jennifer's mother, but as an advocate who had spent 4 decades ensuring her daughter's case remained alive in public consciousness, whose determination had helped inspire the forensic innovations that eventually solved the case, and whose grace in the face of unimaginable loss had exemplified the strength required to survive tragedy without losing one's humanity. Jennifer Hayes' story ended not with the unanswered questions of 1982, but with the truth that emerged in 2024, proving that justice delayed for 42 years is still justice, and that secrets buried for decades can still be exposed when technology, determination, and truth finally converge.